Hello, I'd like to share my experience from attending a free event in St. Louis back in April. It was the St. Louis Global Azure Bootcamp, and it was basically sponsored and presented by Kevin Grossnicklaus from ArchitectNow. Kevin has been pretty much the gentleman responsible for setting up all of those St. Louis days of .NET. He he runs the .NET users group. He has a myriad of knowledge between he and the rest of the folks in his company, from doing a bunch of stuff in Azure, working with React, Angular, lots of Xamarin, basically anything Microsoft. I believe they're doing stuff with Docker containers and all that. But Kevin basically is a really good person in the St. Louis area who's just basically all about knowledge sharing and just getting people in tune with lots of the technology from a Microsoft standpoint. So thanks to him, we were informed of the St. Louis Global Azure Bootcamp, and so we attended that, got myself $80 worth of free credits for Azure, and I decided that I would check into some of the labs. Now, these labs here, I'll put a link here. You can try them yourself. Were created by Microsoft, and basically there's 3 labs, and all 3 of them are pretty detailed and in-depth. The first lab took me about, I would say, about over 10 hours to complete. The second lab, I ran into some issues with the free pass about halfway through. I think it wants you to have a real pay-as-you-go account because it tried to create some deployment slots, which it said the subscription that I had was not good enough to create those deployment slots. So I will circle around and go back to those with my own real pay-as-you-go account. And then the third lab is containers and DevOps. I've done quite a bit in the last year or so with from an academic standpoint and such, with Kubernetes and Docker containers, Docker Swarm, but instead of Swarm, it pretty much use Kubernetes now. So I've worked with researching and deploying Kubernetes clusters on a Google Cloud platform, running my local using Minikube, as well as on AWS. And in this given lab, you'll do it on Azure, as well as Docker, and setting up your own Docker container registry. So the idea basically is you'll also create a build pipeline, which is similar to AWS's code deploy and code pipeline. So if you choose to do this lab, and I'll include the links, you got to go through a set of prerequisites. So the prerequisites itself will probably take you a good few hours just to go through, but you'll learn an awful lot about Azure. And then when you're done with the prerequisites, and they're all like that, they all have prerequisites. After you're done with the prerequisites, then you follow along with the step-by-step. I wish I could actually upload a lot of stuff that I did here as I finish this particular lab. I will say these tutorials by Microsoft were created about a little bit over a year ago, so the screenshots that they provide in here won't always mesh and match up with what you see in the real Azure portal because they have changed things around. I will say I had issues with the version of Kubernetes that they wanted you to deploy to their Azure Container Service. I couldn't get the SSH tunneling working to bring this particular dashboard up. So you can see I'm actually on the VM at this point, but I had to use a later version of Kubernetes in order to get this dashboard up and running. So keep that in mind when you do it. And there's a few other things here too, but I just kind of wanted to give you an end result on what this particular application looks like and not get into too much detail, hoping that you'll go through the tutorial itself. Labs 1 and Labs 3 together cost me close to about $20, but then again, I had the $80 with the free pass, so it didn't spend anything there. But if you attempt to do these labs without a free pass or whatever, just keep in mind that you may run up a bill of about $20, and you'll want to tear down your instances and your resources afterwards. So the gist of this lab, basically the end result, I always kind of like to show the end result. So I'm actually running the Kubernetes dashboard right here, and I'm going to restart this tunnel so that we can get complete access to the dashboard. The tutorial does mention that this dashboard sometimes will have some issues with the tunneling and that it will stop, so you just need to rerun the tunnel right here, and that way you can communicate to your Kubernetes cluster that is running. So basically what you're looking at here is a UI version of, you know, like I'm actually running a Windows system subsystem shell right in my, it's Linux, I should say, it's Ubuntu right here. So I've actually deployed Kubernetes pods over using AKS, which is Azure Kubernetes service. So I actually have 2 nodes running, and as you can see, I've got several pods. I've got an API backend, and then I've got a web front end, and then this init job, which is a kind of a pod that you run. As a matter of fact, I'm just kind of going all over the place, but these are the kinds of things that you'll be doing. This init job, it's a quote kind job for Kubernetes, so Kubernetes treats that as a one-time job. And the long and short of it basically is I'm using secrets. So Azure supports secrets, key vaults, and all that to store the MongoDB connection string. And I deployed an image up to my own Docker container registry. As you can see right there, it's called the content init image. And Kubernetes basically runs this job. It pulls this image down, and it executes it against this MongoDB connection. And as a result of that, if you open up the website, so this external web endpoint is actually a service. It's a Kubernetes service which exposes a single endpoint, and it's kind of like a load balancer, and it's going to delegate requests, incoming requests, to the several pods that it has for the web. So as you can see, I've got 4 images running in pods. So one of those 4 is going to get this request, and it brings up the website right here. And if you select speakers, you can see it's bringing up the speakers. So it's pulling this data. It's pulling this data actually from Azure Cosmos DB, really, because the init job actually took the data out of the Mongo database and put it into the Azure Cosmos DB, which is similar to DynamoDB for AWS. And then here's our sessions. So what's going on there basically is we have a web service. It's a Kubernetes service, and then an API service. And you can click and you can see that I've got 4 pods running here. What else is kind of nice about this is if you say stats, you can see it's basically telling you which of the 4 pods is, or which of the 4 pods is accepting your API request. So if I were to refresh this, you'll notice that this host name is going to change. As you can see, the host name is changing right there. So long and short on that basically is if you go to your services and you go to your API services, you can see we have 4 different endpoints, and these are our 4 different pods, which are our actual container instances running as pods. And we have 4 because we basically told it to. We actually told it to scale up when we did that. So the nice thing about this particular dashboard is you can go to your deployments, and you can see right here that we have 4 web pods, we have 4 API pods, and at any given time, you could scale. So I could scale down to 3 for the API, and now it's going to take just slightly, but it's going to actually scale. So if I say kubectl get pods, you can see it's killing one of the API pods because it wants to make sure that there's always 3 pods up and running. So that's kind of a long and short of it. I'd love to get into much greater detail on that, but the labs, if you choose to do that, it'll show you how to start up and create the deployment files. So here's a deployment file for the APIs. As you can see, it's doing everything by pulling from the Docker container registry, which is really nice. And the container registry itself, so I'm going to go to my dashboard, and if you go to resource groups, Azure has a really nice feature. So I created a resource group, and whenever you create services, whether they're through ARM templates, which is the same thing as CloudFormation, or whether you do it through the console, if you assign all of your resources to a single resource group, like I have right here, these are all of the things that we have in the resource group. As you can see, I've installed application insights for the actual images so that we can get metrics, things of that nature, healthy reports. I have a couple of virtual machines running. I have a security group. As you can see, if you come in from AWS, this is all really familiar. They're pretty much back and forth. I've created my Kubernetes service, which is basically hosting. It's hosting, the Kubernetes master as well as the nodes, and the master is controlling the 2 nodes. As you can see, this is what we got going on right here. So you can look at your cluster. There's our 2 nodes that I have, when these are basically virtual machines. I have my Azure Cosmos DB account. If I click on that, you can basically, and again, this is just like DynamoDB. Inside of here, you can browse the collections that you have in here. And as you can see, we've got our speakers and our sessions collection, which is housing this particular data that you see showing up right in here. So let me go back to there we go. So if we want to take a look, let's see what we got going on here. We can refresh and take a look at this. So as you can see right here, this is just like DynamoDB, where you can take a look at your each of your collections and kind of configure your IOPS like you would with DynamoDB with your throughput. I won't go into detail there because there's quite a bit that's involved with figuring out these parameters and estimates and things of that nature. You have a data explorer, which is kind of nice. So you can take a look at your documents. You can see I've got 4 IDs in the sessions table, and if I click on one of those, you can see the data showing up here, kind of like RoboMongo as well as DynamoDB. You can go to speakers, do the same thing. You can see your documents that you have inside of there. Also, what I find kind of interesting, so these are my virtual machines. So you actually have a build virtual machine, and then you have a development virtual machine. I just so happen to be on my development virtual machine right now. And as you can see, inside of there, I installed the Windows Linux subsystem. So I'm running Ubuntu actually inside of Windows. So I'm actually on my development node here, where I can manage my Kubernetes cluster if I wish. So let's go back to our Kubernetes service. I'm just kind of poking around and showing you what this lab's all about with some of the additional things right here. Let's see here. We've got node pools, so we can take a look at that. We can look at our IAM. permissions. So yes, you do have to create like an RBAC service principal, just like you would with regular Kubernetes. But behind the scenes, when you create the cluster, it'll go ahead and create all of the SSH certificates so that your nodes can communicate back to your master. Does it all for you, which is really nice. Otherwise, you would have to do it yourself by installing Kubernetes. And again, you can go to your virtual machines right here. And I created 4, or actually Kubernetes, when we created the Kubernetes cluster, it went ahead and created these 2 nodes for you as virtual machines right up here. And actually those 2 nodes right here correspond to the Kubernetes dashboard, which is what you're looking at right here. So these are those 2 nodes right there. And then, like I said, again, these are my own virtual machines. Now, what I have yet to show you is one of the virtual machines. It's not so much our development one that we're running from. It's going to be our build agent. So the idea is this is kind of a DevOps thing where your build agent would pull the data out of your Git repo. In this case, it would be our container registry. But so here's our build box. So let me SSH to it. And I got this IP address from right here. So I will SSH. Let's see here. So you set up your public key. So as you can see, I'm actually on my build box. And the nice thing here is I'm using Docker. So we have the content API. Here's our content init and our content web. And the content web, basically, it's all of our source code along with the Docker file to build the source and to create an image. So if you take a look at the Docker file right here, we're using Alpine. We're creating this Docker image from different stages. So the first stage is we're going to create basically a base image from Alpine, and then we use Argon, and we go ahead and install our particular applications, dependencies and stuff like that into this particular build image, if you will. And we go ahead and run it. And then final, it's going to go ahead and take the base image from final, and it's going to copy all of the files from our build image. See this from-build, and it's going to basically look into that directory from this build image that we ran our npm install and all that good stuff, and it's going to copy it locally to our final, which is basically derived from our base image, and then it's going to run npm start on it. But that is the image itself, and we actually run the docker build command. So you say like docker build -t, create a tag, and it runs through this Docker file, and then we go ahead and you know, that's what ends up happening, and that's what ends up getting pushed up to the container registry, if you will. But anyways, that's from a DevOps standpoint. When we make changes, so this build machine, see it basically as a DevOps thing. It'll pull from your Git repo. It'll take all this data, create your Docker file, create, it won't actually create the Docker file here. It'll actually store and push all this data up to your Git repo. And what actually builds the Docker file itself is I have my own Azure DevOps account, and I have my own project right here. It's this pipeline. So as you can see, the pipeline behind the scenes is going to create the images itself and pull them from the Docker container registry. So let's take a look at our Docker. This is our own DevOps, but as you can see, we've got repos right here. As you can see, just like regular TFS or what have you, or Git, we've got our different APIs. We've got our different repositories. So we have our API, init, and our web one. So we can switch back and forth. You can create different branches inside of there. But anyways, the build machine itself is what would actually push the data up here. And so these are 3 different builds, but let me just kind of clarify that. So for like one of the first ones right here, the API, and let's see what we got going on here. You can see the build had occurred. And what happens, like when you do a get push up into this repo, the pipeline wakes up and kicks off this build just like your regular code build does in AWS. And what it does is it checks everything out from Git, and then it's going to create your image by running that Docker build on your Docker file. And when that's done, it's going to go ahead and push that image itself up into your Azure Container Repository, which is a local Docker repo that you have assigned to your account. So it's not a public Docker. And so the end result is your Docker image is sitting out there in the container registry in Azure. So if I go to virtual machines and I take a look, actually, let's go to my resource groups. And if I take a look at my own resource group, you should see a container registry inside of there. And if you click on that, it takes a little bit of time to show up. You can go down to repositories. And as you can see, I've got 3 repos for my Azure Container Registry, and I got my API one. As you can see, we've got our tags. So here's my latest one. I did a few builds on this. Our latest one is tag 5, and what you're looking at is this is just like Docker Hub, where Docker Hub under your own account will host your images, if you will, that you build. So I have a content API image, and then I've got the content web image, and then I've got that one-time job, which is the content init image. So the end result is on the build box. So this is our DevOps build box. This is actually where all the source code resides for the API, the init job, and the web job. Whenever we make changes here, we want to do a get add, and then a get push. And when we do a get push, we're actually pushing it to our own Git repo, per se, if you will, which is in our own account right here under our own DevOps account. So again, taking a look here at our repos. So that's where we're pushing all of our changes. And then automatically, because we went ahead and created a pipeline, and for you AWS folks out there, think code pipeline. It wakes up when you push something out there, and then it performs these steps. So you can always go ahead and create a new pipeline, basically, and queue your builds, things of that nature. It's a nice little feature. And again, the end result of that is you'll have your images pushed up into your Azure Container Registries, in which the actual deploy pipeline can come along and push right up to your container registry. So what happens when your image is up in the container registry? Does it just sit there? No, actually Kubernetes takes over from there. So Kubernetes, when you start up your pods and stuff like that, you specify by deployments. So if we take a look, this is our API project, for example. We have an API deployment and we have a web deployment. Deployments are ways that you can tell Kubernetes, hey, I want to create pods, basically, and I want you to pull the image down from here. And the from here, basically, let's take a look at our web deployment. Basically, this image right here, so we're telling, it's a kind of deployment, and the name of our deployment is called web, and we're saying, hey, when you create this deployment, go ahead, we want to make sure at a minimum that you currently have 1, but I noticed that we've scaled up, so you can scale up. I could always change this and set the replicas to 3, and then do another kubectl apply -f on this file, which will cause Kubernetes to make sure that you have 3 running pods, or you can scale up directly by going to the deployments and choosing from there, you know, how many that you want. But getting back to this image is really important. So this is pulling the image from my Docker container registry inside of Azure. So I'm saying pull this content web image. And if we take a look back here again, it is basically pulling this one, and it's going to pull basically the latest version if you don't have any version specified. If you wanted a specific version of it, you could go down here and you can do like version 3, for example, or whatever you call it. And as you can see, Kubernetes itself has a bit of a learning curve. So I'm not really going to explain that. I'm just saying that in order to set up your Kubernetes cluster, you have to create deployments and then services. And services basically is kind of like a load balancer in AWS, where you can have a load balancer with SSH termination for the most part, and behind the scenes it's going to direct all of the incoming traffic to the other nodes. As you can see, this is a type of load balancer, but it's listening on port 80. And the nice thing about the service, so if you say kubectl get service, you can see I've got my web service running using this external port, IP address, and then behind the scenes, these are the different ports that it can go ahead and direct from, and then you've got your API service, which basically is internal. So you can have internal services running behind the scenes. And of course, I wanted to show you kubectl get deployments. And you can see we've got 3 API nodes running and 4 web nodes running. And again, if I go back to my dashboard and I go down to services, and you can see we've got, you know, you can look at, I need to actually run the tunneling again. So they do mention in the tutorial that your tunnel may go down a few times and you're doing a lot of things, so you just need to rerun it. To be honest, when I installed Kubernetes on my own platforms and all that, I've not really had that issue with the tunneling and the dashboard. So here's our service. So let's take a look at our web service. As you can see, that's our external web point, and then it's our API service. So it shows you all the different pods for your web one right there. You have things like replica sets. Again, you can look at your pods. You can look at the job that we ran, which basically migrates all of the data from Mongo into Cosmos DB. Another kind of nice thing is secrets. So I know there's, you know, been some things where people like to use secrets to store their connection strings and such. And I've done just that with our MongoDB connection string initially, and then we ended up migrating that over into basically Cosmos DB with the job. So as you can see, if I click on the secrets, you can look at the details. And then here's our data. I won't click on this, but it'll actually show the content of your secret. And is there anything else that I probably would like to go over and show? Let me think about it for a second. Okay. No, I can't really think of it. Again, I could talk about this all day long, and I probably have. I apologize for my rambling, but I just kind of wanted to let you know. I'll put a link to this boot camp for you. Set aside a good day or so for each one of these, and that's just to go through the steps. I mean, if you want to learn Kubernetes and if you're not familiar with that and all that kind of stuff, this won't really go into details on that. It'll just basically show you, you know, basically the parameters that you need to enter into your cluster and things of that nature. There's a lot of good courses on Kubernetes, online courses. You can go to Google Docs. Another great one that I took was Kubernetes the hard way, which probably took me about a good 2 weeks to get through. But basically, you set up Kubernetes completely from scratch by using on Linux system by using nothing but package installs, and it's where you set up all of your certificates and such. So for the most part, most people don't really need to do that. I'm just kind of wanted to do that to get a little bit more of an understanding at the time of what makes up the master and what makes up all the individual nodes. But Kubernetes is a prerequisite. You will need an Azure account. Again, the nice thing about this resource group here, I just wanted to mention, is when you're done with it, you can actually click on your resource group and then you could say delete. And when you do that, it basically brings down every single resource that you have inside of here, because it's important when you're done with these labs to make sure you tear down all of your resources so that you will not be charged for this. But by creating all of your resources into a resource group, and yes, you can do that with your ARM templates. You can assign all of your resources to a resource group so you can script that. When you just do the one delete on the resource group, it all goes away and you don't have to worry about any stragglers being left behind and getting a surprise bill. And just like with Azure, with AWS, you can create billing alerts and billing alarms as well. I will say, going to the subscriptions, at the end of the day, when you do at least labs 1 and 3, this is about how much you'll pay if you kind of go through them relatively fast. And what I do is when I would leave for the night or whatever, I would just actually go down and to my virtual machines, and I would just bring down some of my nodes. I would actually stop them so you won't actually be charged for your virtual machines running. Other than that, I think that's about it. So it was well worth it. It's honestly, it's not, even though there's, step-by-steps and instructions and things like that, I wouldn't really call this trivial, because in many cases, the screenshots that you see here will not actually match what you see on your own portal. And again, you'll have to make sure you download and install the latest version of Kubernetes when you set up your AKS. The earlier version of Kubernetes that was specified here was giving me issues with my SSH tunneling, so that I couldn't bring up this particular dashboard. So I basically had to redo that process in order to get this thing working. So other than that, thank you for watching, and I hope you will potentially visit this Azure Bootcamp site and maybe go through the exercises. You take care. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.